In the Tennessee mountains of 1926, neighbors found three sisters competing to see who could inflict the most creative wounds on themselves, believing their dead mother was watching and judging from an empty chair at their kitchen table. The girls had been cutting themselves with sewing needles, burning their hands with lye soap, and sleeping naked in blizzards because their father convinced them it was the only way to prove their love. By the time someone discovered what was happening in that isolated cabin, the competitions had escalated to something so twisted that even hardened mountain folk refused to speak about it for decades. Before we dive into the story, click the like button and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss more shocking stories like this one tomorrow. Also, leave a comment letting me know where you're watching from and what time it is there. I love hearing from viewers around the world. Now, let's continue with the story. The winter of 1926 came early to the Tennessee mountains, blanketing the Martin family cabin in a silence so complete it seemed to swallow sound itself. 5 miles from the nearest neighbor, connected to civilization only by a treacherous dirt path that became impassable during heavy snows, the small wooden structure sat like a forgotten wound in the landscape. Inside, Michael Martin moved through the rooms like a ghost, his footsteps echoing against walls that still held the memory of his wife's laughter. Sarah Martin had died 2 years earlier, leaving behind a husband consumed by grief and 3 daughters who didn't yet understand how dangerous their father's sorrow would become. Michael had always been a stern man, raised in these same mountains where weakness meant death and emotions were luxuries few could afford. But Sarah's death had stripped away whatever gentleness remained in him, leaving something hollow and hungry for purpose. The cabin itself seemed to reflect his deteriorating mental state. Once warm and inviting under Sarah's care, it had become cold and sterile. The family photographs that once adorned the mantelpiece now sat face down, as if Michael couldn't bear to see his wife smile. Yet strange new additions had appeared. Candles burned in odd corners, casting dancing shadows that seemed to move independently of their flames. A chair at the kitchen table remained permanently empty, set with Sarah's favorite plate and cup, as though she might return at any moment. It was during one of those endless winter nights, with wind howling through the gaps in the cabin walls, that Michael first spoke the words that would seal his daughter's fate. He had been staring at that empty chair for hours, his eyes reflecting the candlelight in a way that made him look almost fevered. When he finally turned to face Cordelia, Iris, and young Mercy, his voice carried a conviction that chilled them more than the mountain cold. "Your mother isn't gone," he whispered, his words barely audible above the storm outside. "She's still here, watching us. Watching you 3 especially. She wants to know which of her daughters truly loved her, which one deserves to carry on her memory." The 3 sisters exchanged glances, uncertain whether their father was speaking metaphorically or if grief had finally broken his mind completely. But there was something in his tone, something desperate and dangerous, that warned them this was no mere sentiment. This was the beginning of something that would transform their simple mountain life into a waking nightmare. Outside, the wind seemed to answer Michael's words with a moan that sounded almost human, as if the mountain itself was preparing for the horror about to unfold within the Martin family cabin. The 3 Martin sisters couldn't have been more different from each other, yet each carried the same haunted look that had settled over the family since their mother's passing. Cordelia, at 22, was the eldest and bore the heaviest burden of responsibility. She had inherited her mother's auburn hair and gentle features, but where Sarah had possessed warmth and kindness, Cordelia carried herself with the rigid determination of someone forced to grow up too quickly. Since their mother's death, she had desperately tried to fill the void, cooking, cleaning, and caring for her younger sisters with an intensity that bordered on obsession. Iris, 19 and the middle child, possessed a sharp intelligence that she kept carefully hidden behind quiet compliance. Her dark hair and piercing green eyes gave her an almost ethereal quality, and she had always been the most observant of the three sisters. While Cordelia threw herself into domestic duties, Iris watched and calculated, studying their father's moods and behaviors with the careful attention of someone who understood that survival depended on reading the subtle shifts in his temperament. Mercy, barely 16, remained the most vulnerable of the three. She had been closest to their mother, often found curled beside Sarah during her final illness, listening to whispered stories and gentle lullabies. Now, 2 years later, Mercy still possessed an innocence that her sisters had lost, though shadows had begun to creep into her bright blue eyes. She often spoke to empty rooms as if her mother might answer, a habit that both worried and fascinated their father. Michael Martin had once been a different man entirely. Before grief consumed him, he had worked the small mountain farm with steady hands and provided for his family through hunting and occasional carpentry work in the valley below. Sarah had been his anchor to humanity, the gentle force that kept his mountain-bred harshness from overwhelming their home. She had died slowly, wasting away from an illness that the nearest doctor couldn't identify or treat, leaving Michael to watch helplessly as the light faded from her eyes day by day. The months following Sarah's death had transformed him into something unrecognizable. Where once he had been distant but protective, he now scrutinized his daughter's every action with an intensity that made them uncomfortable. He began comparing them constantly to their mother, noting how Cordelia's bread never rose quite as high as Sarah's, how Iris's sewing stitches lacked their mother's perfect uniformity, how Mercy's attempts at gardening resulted in wilted plants and stunted vegetables. It was during the second winter after Sarah's death that Michael's behavior took its most disturbing turn. He began speaking to the empty chair at their kitchen table, carrying on conversations with his deceased wife, as if she sat there listening. At first, the sisters assumed this was simply his way of processing grief. But as the conversations became more detailed and specific, they realized their father truly believed Sarah was present, watching and judging their every action. The transformation of their home reflected Michael's deteriorating mental state. He removed all mirrors from the cabin, claiming Sarah didn't want to be reminded of her physical absence. He rearranged furniture to accommodate her invisible presence, creating pathways around spaces where he insisted she liked to stand. Most disturbing of all, he began leaving detailed notes around the house, supposedly transcribing Sarah's observations about their daughter's behavior and worthiness. The notes started simply enough, praising Cordelia for her efforts with dinner or complimenting Mercy on her needlework. But gradually, they began comparing the sisters to each other in ways that created tension where none had existed before. Sarah supposedly favored whichever daughter had performed best that day, and Michael would read these assessments aloud during their evening meals, watching his daughters' faces carefully as they absorbed their mother's posthumous judgments. The sisters began to notice changes in themselves as well. Where they had once comforted each other through their shared grief, they now found themselves competing for their father's approval and, by extension, their mother's ghostly favor. Small rivalries emerged over who could prepare the most perfect meal, who could keep their section of the cabin cleanest, who could demonstrate the greatest devotion to their mother's memory. The first act of sabotage happened on a Tuesday morning in late February, when the mountain snow had turned to ice and the world outside seemed frozen in perpetual twilight. Cordelia discovered her carefully prepared bread dough had been deliberately salted beyond use, the precious flour and yeast wasted in what appeared to be a calculated act of destruction. She found Iris humming quietly while mending clothes by the window, her expression perfectly innocent when questioned about the ruined dough. Michael's reaction to the incident revealed just how completely his grief had warped his perception of reality. Rather than addressing the obvious tension between his daughters, he smiled with what appeared to be genuine pleasure and announced that Sarah had whispered to him about the incident during the night. According to him, their mother was testing them, creating opportunities for the sisters to prove their devotion through how they handled adversity and competition. The sabotage escalated quickly after that initial incident. Iris discovered her sewing scissors dulled and her carefully organized thread tangled into knots. Mercy found her precious collection of pressed flowers, gifts from her mother during the final illness, scattered and torn across her bedroom floor. Each act of destruction was subtle enough to maintain plausible deniability, yet pointed enough to send a clear message of rivalry and resentment. What made these incidents particularly disturbing was Michael's enthusiastic response to each one. He would examine the evidence of sabotage with the careful attention of a scholar studying ancient texts, then retreat to his conversations with the empty chair. These consultations would last for hours, during which the sisters could hear him speaking in animated whispers, occasionally laughing or nodding, as if receiving detailed instructions from his deceased wife. The competitions that emerged from these incidents grew increasingly elaborate and bizarre. Michael announced that Sarah had revealed a system for determining which daughter truly honored her memory. Each morning, he would assign tasks that seemed simple on the surface, but contained hidden complexities that pitted the sisters against each other. Cordelia might be asked to prepare a meal using only ingredients their mother had favored, while Iris was challenged to recreate a dress pattern from memory, and Mercy was expected to recite poetry their mother had taught her years earlier. The scoring system for these competitions defied logic or fairness. Michael would disappear into another room for lengthy consultations with Sarah's spirit, then return with detailed evaluations that seemed designed to ensure no sister could achieve lasting victory. Cordelia's perfect recreation of their mother's cornbread recipe would be marked down because she had used slightly too much salt. Iris's flawless needlework would be criticized for lacking the emotional depth that Sarah supposedly valued. Mercy's heartfelt recitation of their mother's favorite psalm would be deemed insufficient because she had stumbled over a single word. The sisters began to realize that winning was impossible, yet losing felt even more dangerous. Michael's mood would darken considerably when discussing the day's failures, and he would spend increasingly long periods talking to the empty chair about disappointment and the need for more rigorous testing. The house itself seemed to absorb this toxic atmosphere, growing colder and more oppressive despite the fires that burned constantly in every room. Sleep became elusive for all three sisters as they lay awake, planning the next day's strategies or worrying about potential sabotage from their siblings. They began hiding their belongings, protecting anything that might be used against them in the morning's competitions. Trust eroded between them as each realized that their father's love had become a finite resource that could only be won at the expense of the others. The psychological toll was evident in their changing behavior and appearance. Cordelia's obsessive attention to detail bordered on mania as she tried to anticipate every possible criticism of her work. Iris grew increasingly withdrawn and calculating, studying her sister's weaknesses with the cold precision of a predator. Mercy, still the youngest and most vulnerable, began experiencing nightmares where her mother appeared to scold her for being inadequate compared to her older sisters. The ceremonies began during the third week of March, when the mountain winds still carried the bite of winter but promised the eventual arrival of spring. Michael announced over breakfast that Sarah had grown tired of simple competitions and desired something more meaningful, more sacred. He had spent the entire previous night in conversation with her spirit, he claimed, and she had revealed the need for formal rituals that would properly honor her memory while testing her daughter's true devotion. The first ceremony took place that very evening, conducted by candlelight in the cabin's main room after Michael had rearranged all the furniture to create a sacred space. He positioned Sarah's empty chair at the center of the room, facing 3 smaller chairs where his daughters were instructed to sit. The flickering candles cast dancing shadows on the walls, creating an atmosphere that felt both reverent and deeply unsettling. Michael began by explaining the rules with the solemnity of a minister conducting a funeral service. Each sister would be required to present evidence of her sacrifice and suffering endured in their mother's name. These presentations would be evaluated not just by him, but by Sarah herself, whose spirit would guide his judgment. The winner would receive their mother's blessing for the following day, while the losers would face additional challenges to prove their worthiness. Cordelia went first, rolling up her sleeves to reveal hands that were raw and bleeding from hours of scrubbing the cabin floors with harsh lye soap. She explained that she had worked through the night without gloves, believing that physical pain would demonstrate her willingness to suffer for their mother's approval. Michael nodded approvingly as he examined her wounded palms, then turned to consult with the empty chair in whispered tones that the sisters couldn't quite hear. Iris presented arms covered in small, deliberate cuts from her sewing needles, explaining that each puncture represented a prayer for their mother's soul. She had calculated exactly 13 wounds, she announced, because that was the number of years their parents had been married before Mercy was born. The precision of her self-inflicted injuries seemed to please Michael even more than Cordelia's raw determination. When Mercy's turn arrived, the youngest sister seemed to shrink into herself, overwhelmed by the elaborate nature of her sister's presentations. She offered only a collection of her own hair, cut roughly and unevenly, explaining that she had read somewhere that hair was a symbol of vanity and wanted to sacrifice her appearance for their mother's memory. Michael's expression grew disappointed as he examined the uneven strands, and his consultation with Sarah's spirit lasted much longer than with the others. The evaluation process was theatrical and disturbing. Michael would address the empty chair directly, asking Sarah's opinion about each presentation, while the sisters sat in uncomfortable silence. He seemed to receive detailed responses, nodding and occasionally arguing with the invisible presence before announcing the results. Iris won that first ceremony, earning the privilege of sleeping in their mother's bed for one night, while Cordelia and Mercy were assigned additional household duties as penance for their inadequate offerings. As the ceremonies became a nightly ritual, the presentations grew increasingly extreme and dangerous. The sisters began competing not just in the nature of their sacrifices, but in their willingness to endure ever greater levels of physical and emotional pain. They started preparing days in advance, hiding their self-inflicted wounds and planning elaborate displays of suffering that would impress both their father and their mother's demanding spirit. The psychological impact of these rituals was devastating. The sisters began to genuinely believe that their mother was present and judging them, accepting their father's delusions as reality rather than facing the terrifying possibility that he had completely lost his sanity. They found themselves talking to empty rooms, asking their mother for guidance on how to better demonstrate their love and devotion. Michael's behavior during these ceremonies revealed the depth of his psychological break from reality. He would often laugh or cry in response to things only he could hear, engaging in lengthy debates with Sarah's spirit about the adequacy of their daughter's offerings. Sometimes he would announce that their mother was displeased with all three presentations, leading to punishments that involved fasting, sleeping on the floor, or spending hours kneeling in prayer for forgiveness. The cabin itself began to reflect the ritualistic nature of their new existence. Michael created a permanent altar around Sarah's chair, decorated with her personal belongings and surrounded by candles that burned continuously. The sisters were forbidden from sitting in that chair or disturbing the sacred space, creating a constant reminder of their mother's ghostly presence and their own inadequacy in comparison to her memory. By April, the hallucinations had become a shared family experience, blurring the line between Michael's delusions and his daughter's desperate need to believe in something greater than their deteriorating reality. It began with small incidents that could have been dismissed as tricks of light or imagination, but gradually evolved into elaborate shared visions that seemed to confirm their father's claims about Sarah's continued presence in their lives. Mercy was the first to report seeing their mother, claiming to have glimpsed Sarah standing by the kitchen window during the early morning hours when mist still clung to the mountain valleys. The vision lasted only seconds, but Mercy described their mother's appearance in vivid detail, noting that she wore the blue dress she had been buried in and seemed to be watching the sunrise with the expression of profound sadness. When Mercy shared this experience during that evening's ceremony, Michael's reaction was one of triumphant validation, rather than concern for his youngest daughter's mental state. Within days, Iris reported her own encounter with their mother's spirit. She claimed to have awakened in the middle of the night to find Sarah sitting on the edge of her bed, gently stroking her hair, as she had done when Iris was a child. According to Iris, their mother had spoken to her in whispers, expressing disappointment about the rivalry between the sisters and urging them to find better ways to honor her memory. The specificity of these details seemed to confirm Michael's belief that Sarah was indeed communicating with the family. Cordelia's vision was the most dramatic and disturbing of the three. She reported seeing their mother standing in the doorway of the kitchen, gesturing for Cordelia to follow her outside into the cold mountain night. In her vision, Sarah led her to a specific spot in the woods behind their cabin, pointing to the ground as if indicating something buried there. When Cordelia tried to approach closer, the apparition vanished, leaving her alone in the darkness with only the memory of her mother's pale, sad face. The shared nature of these hallucinations created a feedback loop that reinforced their father's delusions while providing the sisters with a temporary sense of connection to their lost mother. They began comparing their visions during the nightly ceremonies, looking for common elements that might reveal their mother's true desires or messages. Michael encouraged these discussions, treating each reported encounter as valuable intelligence about Sarah's ongoing involvement in their earthly affairs. The psychological mechanism behind these shared visions was complex and tragic. The sisters had been isolated for so long, subjected to such intense pressure and deprivation, that their minds began creating the very experiences their father claimed were possible. Sleep deprivation from their nightly ceremonies, malnutrition from irregular meals, and constant stress had made them susceptible to hallucinations that felt completely real and meaningful. The content of their visions began to align more closely with Michael's expectations and demands. Sarah's spirit allegedly expressed preferences about which daughter was performing better, offered guidance about future competitions, and provided detailed instructions about rituals that would please her restless soul. These messages always seemed to support Michael's increasingly extreme demands, while pushing the sisters toward ever more dangerous forms of self-sacrifice and competition. The cabin became a place where reality and delusion merged so completely that distinguishing between them was no longer possible. The sisters would sometimes discover objects moved or rearranged in ways that none of them remembered doing, leading to speculation that their mother's spirit was physically manipulating their environment. Candles would flicker in patterns that seemed meaningful. Shadows would move independently of their sources, and strange sounds would echo through the walls during the quiet hours before dawn. What made these experiences particularly dangerous was how they provided validation for Michael's deteriorating mental state, while trapping his daughters in a shared psychosis that made escape seem not just impossible, but undesirable. The winter of 1927 arrived with a vengeance that seemed almost supernatural in its intensity. Snow began falling in October and continued relentlessly through November, burying the mountain paths under drifts so deep that travel became impossible. The isolation that had always defined the Martin family's existence now became absolute, cutting them off from any possibility of outside intervention or escape from their father's increasingly dangerous obsessions. It was during this brutal winter that the competitions transformed from psychological manipulation into life-threatening ordeals. Michael announced that Sarah's spirit had grown impatient with her daughter's lack of genuine sacrifice and demanded tests that would prove their willingness to risk everything for her approval. The comfortable warmth of their cabin became a luxury that had to be earned through increasingly extreme demonstrations of devotion. The first deadly challenge came in early December, when Michael decreed that Sarah wanted to test her daughter's faith by seeing how long they could endure the mountain cold without proper protection. He led them outside into a blizzard wearing only their thin nightgowns, instructing them to remain motionless in the snow until their mother's spirit indicated which one had suffered enough to earn the right to return indoors. Mercy collapsed first, her lips turning blue and her small body shaking uncontrollably after 20 minutes in the freezing wind. But when Cordelia moved to help her younger sister, Michael blocked her path, insisting that Sarah hadn't yet given permission for anyone to retreat. It was Iris who finally won that night's competition, standing rigid in the snow for nearly an hour while her sisters suffered beside her, earning the privilege of sleeping by the fire, while Cordelia and Mercy spent the night shivering on the cold cabin floor. The exposure challenges became a regular feature of their winter routine, with Michael inventing new variations that pushed his daughters closer to death with each iteration. They were forced to sleep outside in makeshift shelters during the worst storms, to walk barefoot through snowdrifts to retrieve firewood, and to remain motionless for hours while ice formed on their hair and clothing. Each challenge was presented as a divine test, ordained by their mother's spirit, making resistance seem not just impossible, but blasphemous. The sisters' physical deterioration was matched by an even more disturbing psychological transformation. They began to welcome the extreme challenges as opportunities to prove their superior devotion, competing eagerly for chances to risk their lives in service to their mother's memory. The boundaries between voluntary participation and coerced compliance dissolved completely as they internalized their father's belief that suffering demonstrated love. Mercy, being the youngest and smallest, suffered the most during these winter ordeals. Her body couldn't endure the cold as well as her older sisters, yet she pushed herself harder than either of them, desperate to prove that her youth didn't diminish her capacity for meaningful sacrifice. She began experiencing episodes where she would slip into unconsciousness during the challenges, her body shutting down to protect itself from the extreme conditions. It was during one of these episodes, in the third week of December, that Mercy claimed to have received the most significant vision of their mother yet. According to her account, Sarah had appeared during her unconscious state and revealed the ultimate test that would finally determine which daughter truly deserved to carry on her legacy. The vision allegedly included specific instructions for a final competition that would end their suffering once and for all, though Mercy refused to share the details until their father deemed the family ready for this ultimate revelation. Michael received this news with an excitement that bordered on mania, spending entire days in consultation with Sarah's spirit to confirm the authenticity of Mercy's vision and prepare for whatever final test their mother had ordained. As the winter deepened and the competitions grew deadlier, something shifted in young Mercy's understanding of their family's nightmare. Perhaps it was the clarity that comes from repeatedly approaching death's threshold, or maybe the maternal instincts that emerged as she watched her older sisters deteriorate before her eyes. Whatever the cause, Mercy began to see through the elaborate web of delusion that had trapped them all, recognizing their father's manipulation for what it truly was. The revelation came during one of their midnight ceremonies, when Mercy noticed her father's lips moving silently during his supposed conversations with their mother's spirit. She realized he was rehearsing responses, crafting Sarah's side of the dialogue in advance to support whatever twisted agenda he had planned. The discovery was both liberating and terrifying, as it meant their mother wasn't actually guiding these competitions, but it also meant their father was completely insane. Mercy's first attempt to protect her sisters was subtle, designed to avoid triggering their father's suspicion. When Michael announced that Sarah wanted them to spend the night buried in snow to test their faith, Mercy quietly slipped extra clothing to Cordelia and Iris, whispering warnings about the signs of frostbite and hypothermia. She began sabotaging the more dangerous competitions by creating distractions that would end the challenges early, or by deliberately failing in ways that would redirect their father's attention. But Michael's madness had progressed too far for such gentle interventions to be effective. He had become completely consumed by his delusions, spending most of his waking hours in conversation with his dead wife and interpreting every event as confirmation of her continued presence and demands. When he began to suspect that someone was interfering with Sarah's divine tests, his paranoia turned violent in ways that shocked even his traumatized daughters. The confrontation came on a night when the mountain wind howled like something alive and hungry. Mercy had been caught placing warm stones from the fire in her sisters' beds before another overnight endurance test. When Michael discovered the heated rocks, his reaction was explosive and terrifying. He accused Mercy of defying their mother's will, of trying to corrupt her sister's pure devotion with comfort and weakness. What followed was the most brutal punishment yet inflicted on any of the sisters. Michael dragged Mercy outside into the blizzard, screaming that Sarah demanded immediate penance for this betrayal of her divine tests. He forced Mercy to strip completely naked and remain motionless in the snow while he lectured her about the consequences of interfering with their mother's spiritual guidance. Cordelia and Iris watched in horror from the cabin windows, forbidden from intervening under threat of facing the same punishment. It was during this punishment that Michael's violence escalated beyond psychological manipulation into physical brutality. When Mercy collapsed from hypothermia, he began striking her with his fists, claiming that Sarah was angry about her daughter's weakness and demanded more severe correction. The beating continued until Mercy lost consciousness. Her small body crumpled in the snow while her father stood over her, still arguing with invisible presences about the adequacy of her punishment. The incident marked a turning point in the family's nightmare. Cordelia and Iris realized that their father's madness had become genuinely murderous, that his delusions were now powerful enough to justify killing his own children. They also understood that Mercy's attempts to protect them had made her the primary target of their father's violence, placing their youngest sister in mortal danger. That night, as they huddled around Mercy's unconscious form, trying to warm her frozen body back to life. The two older sisters finally began planning not just to survive their father's madness, but to escape it entirely. But escape from their isolated mountain prison would prove more difficult and dangerous than either of them could have imagined. The final test that Michael revealed to his daughters in late January was so horrifying that even their traumatized minds struggled to process its implications. According to him, Sarah's spirit had grown frustrated with the incomplete nature of their previous competitions and demanded an ultimate trial that would permanently resolve the question of which daughter was most worthy of carrying on her legacy. The test would involve a form of sacrifice so complete that it would allow one sister to join their mother in death while proving the others unworthy to continue living. Michael explained the rules with the calm precision of someone completely detached from reality. Each sister would be given a sharp knife and instructed to demonstrate her willingness to die for their mother's approval. The sister who showed the greatest commitment to ending her own life would be declared the winner, earning the privilege of joining Sarah in the afterlife. The others would face the knowledge that they had failed their mother's ultimate test, living with the shame of their inadequate devotion. The psychological manipulation behind this final competition was diabolical in its sophistication. Michael framed suicide not as self-destruction, but as the highest form of religious devotion, a sacred act that would reunite his daughters with their beloved mother. He spent days preparing them for this ultimate test, describing in vivid detail how Sarah was waiting in the afterlife to embrace whichever daughter proved brave enough to make the final sacrifice. What made this final competition particularly tragic was how eagerly the sisters embraced it. Months of conditioning had so thoroughly warped their understanding of love and devotion that they genuinely believed dying for their mother was the most beautiful gift they could offer. Cordelia saw it as the ultimate domestic service, the final meal she could prepare for her family. Iris viewed it as the perfect solution to a mathematical problem that had tormented them all winter. Mercy, despite her growing awareness of their father's madness, was too exhausted and broken to resist the promise of ending her suffering. The ceremony took place on a night when the mountain seemed to hold its breath, the usual wind completely still and the snow falling in perfect silence. Michael had prepared the cabin's main room like an altar, with Sarah's chair positioned to overlook the proceedings and candles arranged to cast dramatic shadows on the walls. He presented each sister with an identical knife, explaining that their mother would guide their hands and judge the sincerity of their final offering. What happened next revealed the true horror of Michael's psychological manipulation. As his daughters prepared to end their lives for his twisted interpretation of maternal love, something in Mercy's mind finally snapped back to clarity. Perhaps it was the sight of her beloved sisters preparing to die, or maybe the realization that their mother would never have wanted such a thing. But Mercy suddenly understood the full scope of their father's madness and the need to act decisively to save what remained of their family. The confrontation that followed was swift and brutal. When Mercy threw down her knife and refused to participate in the final test, Michael's reaction was immediate and violent. He accused her of corrupting her sister's pure devotion, of being an agent of evil sent to prevent their reunion with their mother. The beating that followed was savage, far beyond anything he had inflicted before, as if all his accumulated madness had finally found its target. But Mercy's defiance had accomplished something crucial. It had broken the spell of shared delusion that had trapped her sisters, forcing them to see their father's madness clearly for the first time in months. As they watched him brutally assault their youngest sister, Cordelia and Iris finally understood that they were not participating in sacred rituals, but enabling the destruction of their family by a man who had completely lost his sanity. The moment Cordelia and Iris finally saw their father clearly, stripped of the delusions that had protected them from the full horror of their situation, everything changed with terrifying speed. As Michael continued his savage assault on Mercy, something primal awakened in the two older sisters. The maternal instincts that had been twisted into competition suddenly redirected toward protecting their youngest sibling from the monster their father had become. Cordelia moved first, grabbing the iron poker from beside the fireplace and swinging it at Michael's head with desperate strength. The blow connected with a sickening crack that echoed through the cabin, dropping him instantly to the floor beside Mercy's motionless form. For a moment, the only sound was the sisters' ragged breathing and the soft hiss of snow against the cabin windows. Iris quickly checked their father's pulse, while Cordelia knelt beside Mercy, examining the extent of her injuries. Michael was unconscious but alive, blood seeping from a gash above his left ear. Mercy was breathing but unresponsive, her face so swollen and bruised that she was barely recognizable. The sisters faced a horrifying realization. They had attacked their father to save their sister's life, but they were still trapped in an isolated mountain cabin with no way to get help and no guarantee that Michael wouldn't wake up and finish what he had started. The next few hours tested the sisters' survival instincts in ways their father's competitions de victoire never had. They used strips torn from their mother's old dresses to tie Michael securely to a chair, though they had no idea how long the bonds would hold if he regained consciousness. Cordelia applied snow to Mercy's worst injuries, while Iris searched the cabin for anything that might serve as medicine or supplies for a desperate escape attempt. When Michael finally awakened near dawn, his reaction was even more terrifying than his previous violence. Instead of rage or threats, he seemed genuinely puzzled by his restraints, asking his daughters in a conversational tone why they had tied him up when there was still so much work to do preparing for Sarah's final test. The blow to his head had not restored his sanity, but had instead deepened his delusions, making him seem more dangerous and unpredictable than ever. The sisters realized they faced an impossible choice. They could not leave their father tied up indefinitely, as he would eventually free himself or die from exposure in the cold cabin. They could not release him safely, as his madness had clearly progressed to the point where he would attempt to kill them all to satisfy his delusions about Sarah's demands. And they could not abandon the cabin with Mercy in her current condition, as she would never survive a journey through the mountain snow. It was Iris who proposed the solution that would haunt both sisters for the rest of their lives. She had found their father's hunting rifle in his bedroom, along with enough ammunition to end their nightmare permanently. She argued that Michael was no longer their father in any meaningful sense, but a dangerous madman who would continue trying to murder his own children until someone stopped him. The man who had raised them was already dead, killed by grief and madness, and what remained was merely a threat to their survival. The debate that followed was conducted in whispers, while Michael sat bound in his chair, alternately pleading with them to complete Sarah's final test and threatening them with his wife's supernatural vengeance. Cordelia struggled with the idea of killing their father, despite everything he had done to them. But as she looked at Mercy's battered face and remembered the months of torture they had endured, she finally understood that mercy itself sometimes required terrible choices. The gunshot that ended Michael Martin's life echoed across the silent mountain valley like the crack of divine judgment, carrying with it the weight of months of accumulated horror and the desperate hope of three sisters who had finally chosen survival over submission. Cordelia pulled the trigger while looking directly into her father's eyes, seeing, in them, not the man who had raised her, but the madness that had consumed him so completely that nothing recognizable remained. The immediate aftermath was surreal in its quiet simplicity. After months of elaborate ceremonies and psychological torture, Michael's death came without drama or supernatural intervention. There were no ghostly appearances, no vengeful spirits, no divine retribution for their act of desperate self-defense. Sarah Martin's spirit, if it had ever existed at all, seemed content to finally rest in peace now that her daughters were free from their father's twisted interpretation of devotion. The sisters spent the remaining winter months in the cabin, caring for Mercy's injuries and slowly recovering from the psychological trauma that had nearly destroyed them all. They burned their father's body in the woods behind the cabin, along with the ceremonial implements and twisted mementos he had collected during his descent into madness. The empty chair that had supposedly held their mother's spirit was chopped up for firewood, finally serving a practical purpose rather than feeding delusions. When spring finally arrived and the mountain paths became passable again, the three sisters made their way down to the valley community they had not seen in over a year. Their story, carefully edited to remove the most disturbing details, was accepted by neighbors who had always known that isolation and grief could drive mountain families to tragic extremes. Michael Martin had died in an accident, they explained, and his daughters were now seeking new lives away from the memories that haunted their family cabin. Cordelia found work as a seamstress in a town 50 miles from their mountain home, using skills she had perfected during those terrible competitions to build a quiet, stable life. She never married or had children, claiming that she had already experienced enough family drama to last several lifetimes. She died peacefully in 1972, taking most of the details of their mountain nightmare to her grave. Iris moved even farther away, eventually settling in a large city where she could disappear completely into anonymity. She became a librarian, surrounding herself with books and knowledge rather than people, finding comfort in stories that had clear beginnings, middles, and endings. She lived until 1981, never speaking publicly about her childhood experiences, but leaving behind detailed journals that documented the psychological techniques their father had used to manipulate them. Mercy recovered from her physical injuries, but carried emotional scars that never fully healed. She became a teacher, dedicating her life to protecting children and recognizing the signs of abuse that adults often missed or ignored. She married a gentleman who never pressured her to discuss her past, and together they raised 2 daughters in an atmosphere of love and security that honored their mother's true memory rather than their father's twisted interpretation of devotion. The Martin family cabin was eventually reclaimed by the mountain wilderness, its walls collapsing under the weight of snow and time until nothing remained but a stone foundation overgrown with wild roses. Local historians who study the region's past occasionally mention the Martin family tragedy, but the full horror of what happened during that final winter remains known only to the 3 sisters who survived it. Their story serves as a chilling reminder that love, when twisted by grief and isolation, can become indistinguishable from hatred. That protection can transform into destruction, and that sometimes the most loving thing a family can do is recognize when it has become too broken to continue existing. So if this haunting tale of family dysfunction taken to its most terrifying extreme has kept you riveted, click that like button and subscribe to the channel. Because tomorrow, we're diving into another story that will make you question everything you thought you knew about the bonds that tie families together. And trust me, you won't want to miss what we've uncovered next.